There is something happening beneath the surface of your life right now that you have not yet named, not something approaching, not something you need to work toward or earn or finally deserve. Something that has already occurred. Something that shifted in the deeper layers of what you are, while the surface version of you was still looking forward, still waiting for the signal, still rehearsing for a transformation that had already completed itself beneath your feet. What you think of as your future self. The version you've been straining toward, the one who has it together, the one who has finally arrived. That version is not ahead of you. It's beneath you. And that single inversion changes everything. We have been taught to think of personal transformation as a forward movement, a journey, a destination somewhere out ahead on the horizon that you travel toward through enough effort, enough healing, enough becoming. You work on yourself, you grow, you move forward, and one day, if you've done enough, you arrive at the new version of yourself. That model feels intuitive, it feels motivating, and it is almost entirely wrong. Because the actual mechanics of transformation, not the motivational narrative of it, but the actual quantum and neurological and experiential mechanics of how change happens in a living system. Those mechanics reveal something completely different from the forward motion story you've been told. Change does not happen ahead of you. It happens beneath you. And the most disorienting thing about genuine transformation is that by the time you feel it, it is already done. The surface of your life, your circumstances, your relationships, your sense of who you are, that surface is always the last place the change arrives. Because the surface is the outermost layer, and transformation begins at the deepest one. This is what we are going to explore today. Layer by layer, peeling back the surface, understanding of what personal change actually is, until we reach something underneath it that most people never see, not because it is hidden from them, but because they stopped looking at the level above it and assumed they had seen everything. You have not seen everything. Not yet. But by the time we reach the deepest layer today, you will understand something about yourself that will make it impossible to keep waiting for a transformation that has already happened. Let's begin at the surface. Let's begin with what you think you know. You believe you are in the process of becoming someone. You sense, correctly, that something has shifted in you. You feel it in the way certain things no longer fit, in the restlessness that has settled into your days like a new weather pattern, in the way you find yourself pausing before decisions you used to make automatically, as if something in you is checking whether the old answer still applies. You feel the friction. You feel the mismatch. You feel like you are standing in a life that was tailored for someone slightly different from who you are right now. And your interpretation of all of that feeling, the interpretation you have been given by every self-help framework and every transformation narrative you have ever consumed, is that the feeling means you are not there yet, that the friction is evidence of incompletion, that the restlessness means the work is unfinished, that the mismatch between who you are and the life around you means you still have more becoming to do before you arrive. That interpretation is the surface layer, and like all surface layers, It is not wrong exactly. It is just the thinnest slice of what is actually happening. It is the outermost skin stretched over something with far more depth. Because here is what the friction actually is. Here is what the restlessness is actually telling you. Here is what the mismatch between you and your current circumstances is actually evidence of. It is evidence that you have already changed, not that you need to. The restlessness is not the sound of someone who hasn't arrived. It is the sound of someone who has arrived and is still standing in the old location. The friction is not the feeling of becoming. It is the feeling of having become and not yet having rearranged the external layer to match the internal one. Your system has already updated. The surface just hasn't caught up. And this is not a metaphor. This is not motivational language designed to make you feel better about where you are. This is the actual sequence of events in any genuine transformation, supported by what quantum mechanics reveals about the nature of change in complex systems, and mapped with extraordinary precision by ancient wisdom traditions that understood something about the architecture of human transformation long before we had the instruments to measure it. But we are still at the surface. Let's peel back the first layer and look at what's underneath. When you think about personal change, the kind of deep, identity-level transformation where you genuinely become a different version of yourself, what do you imagine the sequence looks like? Most people imagine it this way. You decide to change. You do the work. You have the breakthrough. You become the new version. And then your life reflects that new version back to you. Decision, then effort, then transformation, then new reality. That is the surface model, and it is backward. The actual sequence, the one that quantum mechanics and neuroscience and the lived experience of everyone who has ever genuinely transformed would confirm, looks more like this. Something shifts in the deepest layer first, a reorientation so fundamental that it happens beneath conscious awareness, beneath decision, beneath intention. The field shifts before the particle does. The pattern changes before the behavior does. The identity updates before the performance catches up. And then, slowly, the outer layers begin to rearrange themselves in response to what has already changed at the core. You start making different choices. Not because you decided to make different choices, because the thing that makes choices has already become different. You find certain things intolerable that you used to endure without question. Not because you worked on your boundaries, because the version of you that was willing to cross those lines has already departed, and the version that remains simply does not recognize those situations as options anymore. You stop being drawn to certain people, certain conversations, certain environments, not because you made a conscious decision to upgrade your social circle, because something in you has already moved to a different frequency, and the old signals no longer reach you the way they used to. The change happened first. The behavior is just the surface expression of what already occurred at a deeper layer. And here is the part that most people miss completely, the part that keeps them trapped in the waiting room of their own transformation. Because the surface expression is always delayed. Always. The outer layer is always the last to shift. which means that if you are waiting for your outer circumstances to confirm your inner transformation before you believe the transformation is real, you will always be waiting. You will always feel like you haven't arrived yet, because you are measuring arrival by the outermost layer, and the outermost layer is always catching up. This is the first veil, the belief that transformation is confirmed by external evidence, that you will know you've changed when your life looks different, when people treat you differently, when circumstances rearrange to reflect your new self. But lift that veil and look at what's underneath it. Transformation is confirmed by internal evidence, by the friction you feel in spaces that no longer fit, by the restlessness that won't quiet down, by the choices you find yourself making that the old version of you would not have made, not because you forced yourself to make them, but because they were the only choices available to the person you have already become. That is the first layer beneath the surface. The change has already happened. The surface is the last place it arrives. But there is a layer beneath that. If this kind of depth is what you are here for, go ahead and like this video and subscribe so these transmissions keep finding you. Let's go deeper. Let's go to the place where quantum mechanics reveals something about the nature of change that should have rewritten everything we understand about transformation, but that most people stopped reading about before they reached the part that mattered. You have heard of quantum superposition, the principle established through decades of experimental physics, that a quantum system exists in multiple states simultaneously until it is observed, until measurement collapses the wave function into a single definite state. The surface version of this idea, the version that shows up in popular science explanations and gets referenced in self-help contexts, is that observation affects reality, that the act of measurement changes what is measured, that consciousness and reality are entangled in some fundamental way. That is the surface layer, and it is accurate as far as it goes. But peel back that surface and look at what's underneath. The deeper implication, the one that physicists have been grappling with since the Copenhagen interpretation first surfaced in the 1920s, the one that Erwin Schrödinger was pointing at with his famous thought experiment, the one that the many worlds interpretation and the pilot wave theory and every serious attempt to understand what quantum mechanics actually means has been circling, is this. The state of the system is not determined at the moment of observation. The state is determined by the relationship between the observer and the system, by the entanglement between the thing being observed and the thing doing the observing, which means that what you see is not separate from who is seeing. The observer and the observed are not two separate things. They are a single entangled system. And the state of that system, what it looks like, what it does, what possibilities are available to it, is a function of the entire entangled relationship, not just the object being looked at. Now bring this into the territory of your own transformation. If you are the observer and your life is the system being observed, then the state of your life, the possibilities available to it, the directions it can go, the version of itself it collapses into, is not determined solely by your circumstances. It is determined by the entangled relationship between you and your circumstances, which means that when you change, when the observer changes at a fundamental level, the system you are observing changes with you, not because you forced it to, not because you worked on it from the outside, but because the entanglement itself has been altered. The relationship between the observer and the observed has shifted, and so the system must collapse into a different state. This is not metaphor. This is the logical extension of what quantum mechanics found beneath the surface of matter. You are not separate from your life. You are entangled with it. And when the deepest layer of you shifts, when the observer changes at the level of identity, at the level of what you fundamentally believe is possible, at the level of what you recognize as real, the entangled system you call your life must respond, must rearrange, must collapse into a state that corresponds to the new observer. The question is not whether your life will change when you change. The question is whether you have changed deeply enough at the quantum level of identity, not just the surface level of behavior, for the entanglement to register. And here is what the quantum mechanics of transformation reveals about that question. The deepest changes happen first at the level of the field, not at the level of the particle, not at the level of behavior or circumstance or visible outcome. At the level of the quantum field of potentiality that underlies all of those surface expressions. You change at the field level, and then the particles, the behaviors, the circumstances, the visible features of your life collapse into new states that correspond to the new field. This is why the change always feels like it happened before you noticed it. Because it did. It happened at a level beneath the visible surface, at the quantum substrate of your identity, and by the time it expresses itself in behavior, in choice, in the way you move through the world, the field level change is already complete. You have already become your new quantum self, not as a future possibility, as a completed fact at the deepest layer of what you are. The surface is still catching up, but there is a layer beneath even that. Because if quantum mechanics is the science that reveals what lies beneath the surface of matter, there is an older science, if we can call it that. A system of knowing that mapped these hidden layers long before instruments existed to measure them. And what that older knowing found in the depths of human transformation is something that should stop you completely, because it is identical to what quantum mechanics found, expressed in completely different language, drawn from completely different methods, but pointing at exactly the same hidden architecture. Let's go to that layer now. In the Vedantic tradition of ancient India, one of the most sophisticated systems of consciousness exploration ever developed, there is a concept called Turiya. It is often translated as the fourth state, not the first, second, or third. The fourth. Beyond waking, dreaming, and deep sleep, the state that underlies and permeates all other states, the ground of awareness itself. The surface understanding of Turiya, the layer most people encounter when they first read about it, is that it is a mystical state accessible only through deep meditation, a special experience available to advanced practitioners. Peel back that surface and look at what's underneath. Turiya is not a state you enter, it is the state you already are, the ground of awareness that is always present, the substrate of consciousness that exists beneath every experience you have ever had. It is not something you achieve, It is what remains when you stop overlaying it with the performance of your conditioned self. The Vedantic sages were saying something precise, not poetic, precise. They were saying that beneath the surface layer of your performed identity, beneath the thoughts, the beliefs, the behaviors, the self-concept you have constructed and maintained, there is a layer of awareness that is already whole, already complete, already the fullest version of what you are, not becoming, already being. And the work of transformation in this ancient framework is not to build something new. It is to stop obscuring what is already there, to peel back the layers of conditioned identity until what remains is the ground state, the turiya, the quantum field of your deepest self, which has always been present and has always been whole. The Sufi tradition calls this the Ruh, the essential spirit that exists beneath the nafs, the ego self, the performed personality. The Rumi poems that have been read and loved for 8 centuries are not love poetry in the conventional sense. They are precise maps of the layers between the surface self and the essential self, between the performed identity and the ground state of what you actually are. When Rumi writes about the longing of the reed flute for the reed bed it was cut from, he is describing exactly this. The ache of a surface self that has been separated from its own depth, that has been cut from the ground state of its own being, and is now playing its song of longing, not for something external, but for the deeper layer of itself that it has forgotten is still there. The Buddhist concept of Buddha nature is another map of the same hidden territory. The teaching that every sentient being already possesses the nature of awakening, not as a potential to be developed, as a present reality to be uncovered. The layers of confusion and conditioned reactivity are like clouds obscuring a sky that was never not there. Remove the clouds and you do not create the sky, you reveal it. These are not separate traditions pointing at different things. They are different excavation teams digging at the same site from different angles and finding the same layer beneath the surface. The deepest layer of what you are is not something you become. It is something you return to, something you uncover, something that was already there beneath every layer of performance and conditioning and constructed identity you have ever worn. And what these ancient traditions understood, what they mapped with extraordinary precision across thousands of years of direct exploration, is that transformation is not the addition of something new to the surface. It is the subtraction of what has been layered over the ground state. The removal of what was never truly you, so that what is truly you can finally be seen. The new self you have been trying to become is not new at all. It is the oldest layer of what you are. The one that was there before the conditioning, before the performance, before the agreements you made about who you were allowed to be and what you were allowed to want, and how much of yourself you were allowed to take up. It has always been there, beneath everything. And this is where the quantum and the ancient converge into something that should stop you completely. Because quantum mechanics says, The ground state of the field is always present. The particles collapse into various configurations on the surface, but the field itself, the quantum vacuum, the zero-point energy, the ground state of all possibility, is always there. Beneath every surface expression, beneath every collapse into a particular state, the field is always there. And the ancient wisdom traditions say, the ground state of awareness is always present. The conditioned self expresses itself in various configurations on the surface, but the essential self, the Turiya, the Ru, the Buddha nature, is always there. Beneath every surface expression, beneath every performance of conditioned identity, the ground state is always there. Two completely different systems of knowing, two completely different methodologies. The same hidden layer. This is where the veil lifts. The new quantum self you have been trying to become is not a future version of you. It is the ground state of you. It is what has always been there beneath the layers. And the transformation that has been happening, the one you have been feeling in the friction and the restlessness and the mismatch between who you are and the life around you. That transformation is not the construction of something new. It is the uncovering of what was always there. You have not been building a new self. You have been shedding the layers that were covering the one that was already there. And here is the most important thing. Here is the layer beneath the layer beneath the layer. When those layers shed, when the conditioned patterns fall away, and the ground state begins to express itself more directly in your choices, and your preferences, and your sense of what is tolerable and what is not, that is not a process you control. It is a process that happens to you, or more precisely, it is a process that happens through you, as you, from the deepest layer of what you are. You do not decide to shed the old self. The old self becomes too small to contain what is pressing up from beneath it. You do not choose to outgrow your old patterns. The ground state of who you are simply becomes too present, too insistent, too real to be covered by those patterns any longer. The change happens first at the level of the ground state, and then the surface layers, the behaviors, the choices, the preferences, the sense of what fits and what doesn't. Those begin to rearrange themselves to match. By the time you notice the change, it has already happened. At the deepest level. The surface is just now catching up. You have already become your new quantum self. Now let me show you something. Let me take you into a story that maps the territory we have been exploring, not as metaphor, but as a precise illustration of the hidden mechanics we have been uncovering layer by layer. There was a woman named Mara who lived in a city built on ancient ruins. She did not know about the ruins at first. Nobody in the city did, not really. They knew in the abstract way you know about things that don't feel relevant to your daily life. They knew there had been something before, something older. But the city on the surface was so complete, so functional, so full of familiar structures and established patterns, that the layer beneath it felt like history. Interesting, perhaps, but not present, not alive, not relevant to the business of living in the city as it currently existed. Mara had a life that worked, not brilliantly, not in a way that made her feel like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, but in the way that a well-fitted piece of clothing works. It was the right size for who she had been when she chose it. It covered what needed to be covered. It was acceptable. She had a role in the city's administration. She had relationships that made sense given who she was understood to be. She had a daily rhythm that had been established over years of small decisions, each one reasonable in isolation, each one adding another layer to the structure of her life until the structure had become so solid that it no longer felt like a choice. It felt like reality. And then something began to happen beneath the surface. She did not notice it at first. She noticed only the symptoms, a restlessness that had no clear cause, a sense that certain conversations she had been having for years without any difficulty, now felt like wearing shoes that were slightly too small. Not painfully wrong, just not quite right, just tight enough to be distracting. She noticed that she was making different choices, small ones, choosing to walk a different route through the city, choosing silence over the usual noise of her evenings, choosing, for the first time in years, to sit with her own thoughts rather than filling the space around them with the familiar sounds of her established life. She thought she was going through a phase. She thought she was tired. She thought she needed a vacation, a change of scenery, something to refresh the surface of her life, so she could return to it renewed. She did not yet understand that what was happening was not on the surface. One day, a section of the city's old district was undergoing renovation. Workers digging beneath a building to reinforce its foundation had broken through to something unexpected. A layer beneath the layer they had been working on, stone structures perfectly preserved from a civilization that had existed in that place thousands of years before the current city had been built. The discovery was remarkable. Archaeologists came. The ruins were mapped and studied. And what they found was extraordinary, not just for its age, but for its precision. The ancient civilization had built their city according to principles of alignment and proportion that the modern city above had, through centuries of incremental construction, completely obscured. The surface city was built on a foundation of something far more carefully designed, something that had known things the surface city had forgotten. Mara went to see the ruins. She descended the stairs that had been constructed to allow visitors to view the excavation. And standing in that underground space, surrounded by the ancient stone that had been hidden beneath the city her entire life, she felt something shift. Not in her mind, not in her understanding. In a layer beneath both of those, something she could not name but could not mistake. She stood there for a long time, and when she came back up the stairs into the city above, she was different. Not in any way she could immediately articulate, not in any way that anyone around her would have immediately noticed, but different in the way that someone is different after they have seen something that cannot be unseen. After they have become aware of a layer that was always there, but that they had never known to look for. Over the following weeks and months, her life began to rearrange itself, not because she forced it to, not because she sat down and made a plan for transformation, but because the awareness of the deeper layer had changed the relationship between her and the surface. She could no longer look at the city she lived in without knowing what was underneath it. She could no longer move through her established life without feeling the presence of the deeper layer beneath it. The more carefully designed, more precisely aligned version of herself that had been there all along, hidden beneath the accumulated layers of what she had built on top of it. The role that had fit her for years began to feel like a structure that had been built without reference to the foundation beneath it. Misaligned. Not wrong in itself, but wrong for this particular ground. The relationships that had made sense for who she had been understood to be began to show their own misalignments, not because the people in them had changed, but because she was now aware of a deeper layer of herself that those relationships had never been in contact with, had never even known was there. She did not blow up her life. She did not make dramatic declarations or sudden departures. She simply began, slowly and consistently, to make choices that were aligned with the deeper layer rather than the surface one. To let what no longer fit fall away without forcing it. To move toward what resonated with the ground state rather than what was familiar to the constructed surface. And what she discovered, as the surface rearranged itself to match the depth, was that the deeper layer had always been there. That it had not been damaged by the years of surface construction on top of it, that it was in fact more solid, more precisely designed, more fundamentally itself than anything she had built on the surface. She had not needed to build a new self. She had needed to excavate the one that was already there. The ruins were not the past. They were the foundation. They were what everything else had been built on top of, and what everything else would need to align with if the city above was ever going to feel like it was built on solid ground. And you have been living in a city built on top of something older and more precisely designed than anything on the surface. Something that has always been there. Something that has always been you, at the deepest layer of what you are. The excavation has already begun. The deeper layer has already been broken through to. The awareness has already shifted. The surface is now rearranging itself to match what was found beneath it. You did not build a new self. You uncovered the one that was always there. This is where the veil lifts. Pause here for a moment and tell me in the comments, what is the hidden layer you have recently broken through to? What is the thing you always sensed was beneath the surface of your reality, but couldn't articulate until now? What truth was hiding in plain sight until you were finally ready to see it? I want to know what the community of depth seekers is finding beneath the surface. Now let's do something with this. Because understanding a hidden layer is only the first step. The next step is to perceive it directly, to feel the difference between the surface and the depth in your own experience, right now, in this moment. I want you to try something, not as an exercise in visualization or positive thinking, as an act of genuine perception, as an archaeological move, a deliberate descent from the surface to a deeper layer. Think of something in your life right now that feels like friction, not dramatic conflict. Friction, the low-grade resistance of something that used to fit and no longer does. A situation, a relationship, a role, a habit. Something that has been feeling slightly wrong for a while now. Slightly too small. Slightly misaligned with something you cannot quite name. Hold that feeling. Now, Instead of interpreting that friction as evidence that something is broken, instead of reading it as a problem to be solved or a failure to be explained, read it as information about a hidden layer. What if that friction is not the feeling of being stuck? What if it is the feeling of having already moved? What if the mismatch between you and that situation is not evidence that you haven't changed yet, but evidence that you have already changed, and the situation hasn't caught up? Feel the difference between those two interpretations. Not in your mind, in your body, in the layer beneath thought. The first interpretation, the surface one, produces a particular sensation, something like heaviness, like being behind, like there is work to be done before you are allowed to feel different. The second interpretation, the deeper one, produces something completely different. Something like recognition, like arriving, like the friction is not an obstacle but a signal, a confirmation, evidence of the ground state pressing up through the surface layers. Feel where that lands, not as a concept, as a physical sensation, as a shift in the layer of you that exists beneath your thoughts about yourself. That shift, that subtle but unmistakable reorientation in the layer beneath thought, that is what we are talking about. That is the quantum self you have already become, making itself known through the layer of felt experience, through the body, through the part of you that knows things before the mind has language for them. The ancient traditions called this the heart's knowing, not the emotional heart, not the sentimental heart, but the heart as the seat of deep perception, the organ of the deeper layer, the place in the body where the ground state speaks most directly. In the Sufi tradition, the heart is understood as the mirror of divine reality, not metaphorically, precisely. The heart is the layer of the human system that is most directly in contact with the deepest layer of what is real, and it communicates through sensation, through resonance, through the felt sense of alignment or misalignment that you experience in your body before your mind has constructed an explanation for it. That feeling you have been having, the one you have been trying to explain, trying to diagnose, trying to fix, that feeling is the heart's communication from the deeper layer. It is not a problem. It is a transmission. It is the ground state of who you are, communicating through the layer of felt experience, telling you something that the surface mind has been too busy performing to hear. You have already changed. The heart knows, the body knows, the deeper layer knows, the surface is still catching up. Now let's go to the layer beneath the practice, the layer that explains why this is so hard to see, why the surface keeps insisting it is the whole story, even when the depth is clearly present. There is a reason you have been waiting for external confirmation of an internal transformation that has already occurred. And it is not a character flaw. It is not a failure of courage or clarity or self-awareness. It is a structural feature of the way consciousness relates to its own surface. Here is the hidden layer beneath the waiting. The surface self, the constructed identity, the performed personality, the collection of beliefs and behaviors and self-concepts you have assembled over a lifetime. That surface self has a survival imperative. not in the biological sense. In the structural sense, the surface self exists by being consistently itself, by maintaining coherence across time, by being recognizable to itself and to others. This is not a flaw in the system, it is a feature. The surface self's coherence maintenance function is what allows you to have a continuous sense of identity across time. It is what makes it possible to have relationships, to make plans, to build anything that extends beyond the present moment. The surface self's insistence on its own continuity is, in most contexts, adaptive. But in the context of genuine transformation, in the context of the ground state pressing up through the surface layers and the surface beginning to rearrange itself to match, that same coherence maintenance function becomes the primary source of resistance, because the surface self does not recognize the new state as itself. The new configuration, the one that corresponds to the deeper layer that has already shifted, looks, from the surface self's perspective, like a threat to its coherence, like something that needs to be resisted, like an identity that hasn't been verified yet and therefore cannot be trusted. And so the surface self does what it is designed to do. It looks for evidence of its own continuity. It notices every moment that seems to confirm the old pattern, every anxiety that resembles the old anxiety, every choice that looks like the old choice, every way in which the new state has not yet fully expressed itself on the surface. And it presents all of that evidence as proof that the transformation hasn't happened yet, that you are still the old self, that the new self is still ahead of you, not already beneath you. This is what the source transcript was pointing at when it described the experience of building a case against your own transformation. Like a lawyer collecting evidence, you notice every moment of doubt, every instance of falling back into old patterns, every time the surface self successfully reasserts its old configuration. And you present all of it as proof that you haven't really changed. But you are not looking at the full picture, you are looking at the surface. And the surface is always the last layer to fully rearrange. Beneath every moment of doubt, there is a layer that has already moved. Beneath every instance of the old pattern reasserting itself, there is a ground state that has already shifted beyond it. The old pattern is not evidence that the transformation hasn't happened. It is evidence that the surface is still catching up to a transformation that is already complete at the deeper level. The quantum self you have already become is not threatened by the surface self's resistance. The ground state is not weakened by the surface pattern reasserting itself. The field does not stop being the field because the particles on the surface are still collapsing into old configurations. The field has already shifted. The particles will follow. But there is something you need to understand about why the particles take so long to follow. And this is the layer beneath the layer we have just explored. In quantum field theory, there is a concept called spontaneous symmetry breaking. It is the process by which a system that exists in a symmetric ground state, a state of pure, undifferentiated potential, transitions into a state where that symmetry is broken, where a particular configuration is chosen from the infinite possibilities of the field. The famous example is the Higgs field, which is responsible for giving particles their mass. In the early universe, the Higgs field existed in a symmetric state. All configurations were equally possible. But as the universe cooled, the field underwent spontaneous symmetry breaking. It settled into a particular configuration, and in doing so, it gave the particles that interact with it a definite mass, a definite identity, a definite surface expression of what had been, at the field level, a state of infinite possibility. The surface expression, the particles with their definite masses, came after the field level change. The field shifted first. The surface followed. This is the precise quantum mechanical analog of what happens in genuine personal transformation. The field of your identity, the quantum ground state of who you are at the deepest layer, undergoes a shift, a spontaneous symmetry breaking. The infinite possibilities of the field settle into a new configuration, a new attractor state, a new ground state that corresponds to the version of you that has been pressing up from beneath the surface. And then, slowly, the surface particles, the behaviors, the choices, the circumstances, the sense of who you are, begin to rearrange themselves to match the new field configuration. The field shifted first, the surface is following. And here is where this gets precise in a way that should change how you relate to everything you have been experiencing. In spontaneous symmetry breaking, the field does not return to the old symmetric state once it has settled into the new configuration. The transition is not reversible. The new ground state is stable. The old configuration is no longer available to the field, which means this: the transformation that has already occurred at the level of your deepest identity is not reversible. The new ground state you have already settled into is stable. The old configuration, the old version of you, the one you keep consulting, the one you keep performing, the one you keep using as the standard against which you measure your current self. That configuration is no longer available. You cannot go back. Not because it would be wrong to go back, because the field has already moved. The old configuration no longer exists as a stable state for the system that you are. What you experience as falling back into old patterns is not a return to the old ground state. It is the surface particles briefly reasserting an old configuration while the field beneath them continues to stabilize in the new one. It is the lag between the field level change and the surface level rearrangement. It is not evidence that the transformation hasn't happened. It is evidence of the gap between the deepest layer and the outermost one. The gap is real. The lag is real. But the direction is not reversible. You have already become your new quantum self. The surface is in the process of catching up. Now let's go to the deepest layer, the one beneath the quantum mechanics, the one beneath the ancient wisdom, the one that is not a concept or a framework or an explanation, but an experiential truth that exists in the territory of direct knowing. There is a moment, and perhaps you have had it, perhaps you are having it right now, when the understanding stops being intellectual and becomes something else. When the concepts fall away, and what remains is a direct perception of what the concepts were pointing at. This is that moment, beneath the understanding that the change has already happened, beneath the quantum mechanics of field-level transformation, beneath the ancient maps of ground state identity, beneath all of it, there is just you, right now, in this moment. Not the performed version, not the constructed identity, not the surface self that has been maintaining coherence across time, just the awareness that is present right now, beneath all of those layers. And that awareness, the ground state of your own consciousness, the Turiya, the Ru, the Buddha nature, the quantum field of your deepest identity, that awareness is not waiting for anything. It is not waiting to become something. It is not waiting for permission. It is not waiting for external confirmation. It is not waiting for the surface to catch up. It is already whole, already complete, already the fullest version of what you are, and the new quantum self you have been trying to become, the version you have been straining toward, the one who has arrived, the one who is finally free of the old patterns and the old limitations and the old sense of who you were allowed to be. That self is not ahead of you. It is this, right now, this awareness, this ground state, this presence that has been here beneath every layer of performance and conditioning and constructed identity you have ever worn. You did not need to build it. You needed to stop covering it. And the covering, the layers of conditioned identity, the performance of the old self, the coherence maintenance function that kept insisting you were still who you used to be. That covering has been falling away, not because you forced it to, because the ground state beneath it has been pressing up with increasing insistence, because the field has already shifted, because the transformation is already complete at the deepest level. The surface is catching up, and in the moments when you feel most like yourself, not the performed self, not the constructed self, not the self that is trying to be acceptable or impressive or consistent, but most like yourself. In those moments of unexpected clarity, unexpected ease, unexpected recognition that something has shifted and you cannot quite say when, in those moments, you are in contact with the ground state. You are feeling the quantum self you have already become, not as a future possibility, as a present reality, not ahead of you, beneath you, and through you, and as you. This is where the veil lifts completely. Let's talk about what this means in practice. Because the deepest layer of understanding is only useful if it changes something at the surface, if it gives you a different way of moving through your actual life. Here is what changes when you understand that the transformation has already happened at the deepest level. You stop waiting for permission. This is the most practical implication of everything we have explored today. The permission you have been waiting for. The signal that you have finally changed enough to be allowed to be different, to make different choices, to inhabit a different kind of life. That permission will never come from outside you, not because the world is withholding it, but because it is not the world's to give. The permission is internal, and it is not a future permission. It is a present recognition, a recognition that the person who is qualified to live the life you can feel pressing up from beneath the surface of your current one, that person is already here, is already you, has already made the transformation that qualifies them. You are not rehearsing for a life you will one day be allowed to live. You are standing in the gap between the life that corresponds to your old ground state and the life that corresponds to the new one. And the gap feels like waiting. It feels like incompletion. It feels like evidence that you haven't arrived. But it is not evidence of incompletion. It is evidence of the lag between the deepest layer and the outermost one. The field has already shifted. The surface is rearranging. The gap is not a sign that you haven't changed. It is the sign that you have. So what do you do with the gap? You stop performing the old self to fill it. This is the most specific, most practical, most immediately applicable instruction that everything we have explored today points toward. Stop performing the old self to fill the gap. Every time you consult the ghost of who you used to be before making a decision, every time you ask yourself what the old version would do, or what the people who knew the old version expect, or whether the new choice is consistent with the identity you have been maintaining, you are performing the old self to fill the gap. And every performance of the old self delays the surface rearrangement. Not because it reverses the field level change. The field has already shifted. That is not reversible. But because the surface rearrangement happens through your choices, through the decisions you make in the gap, through the way you inhabit your life, in the space between the field level change and the full surface expression of it. Every choice you make from the new ground state, from the awareness of who you have already become at the deepest layer, is a surface particle collapsing into the new configuration. Every choice you make from the performance of the old self is a surface particle temporarily reasserting the old configuration. The field is pulling in one direction. Your choices determine how quickly the surface catches up. So stop consulting the old self. Stop asking its permission. Stop performing its preferences. Stop maintaining its relationships, its habits, its sense of what is acceptable and what is not, its story about who you are and what you are capable of, and how much of yourself you are allowed to take up. The old self is not a wise elder to be consulted. It is a layer that has already been shed at the deepest level, a skin that the ground state has already grown beyond, a configuration that the field has already moved past. Consult instead the layer beneath it, the ground state, the awareness that is present right now, beneath all the performance and all the conditioning and all the constructed identity, the one that knows without needing to explain its knowing, the one that recognizes without needing external confirmation of its recognition. That is the layer to consult. That is the self that has already arrived. And here is what happens when you do. When you stop consulting the old self and start making choices from the ground state, from the quantum self you have already become, the surface begins to rearrange with a speed that surprises you. Not because you forced it, because you stopped holding it in place. The old surface configuration was being maintained not just by inertia, but by your active participation in it. Every time you performed the old self, every time you showed up to the old expectations, the old relationships, the old sense of what your life was supposed to look like, you were actively reinforcing the old surface configuration. You were providing the energy that kept the old particles in the old arrangement. Stop providing that energy, and the old configuration begins to dissolve on its own. Not dramatically, not overnight, but with a consistency and a direction that, once you notice it, becomes unmistakable. The life that corresponds to your new ground state is not something you have to build from scratch. It is something that will naturally emerge as the old surface configuration stops being actively maintained. As the energy that was going into the performance of the old self is redirected toward the expression of the new ground state. You are not building, you are revealing. You are not becoming, you are uncovering. You are not arriving at something new. You are returning to something ancient, the oldest layer of what you are, the ground state that was always there beneath everything. Now let me ask you something, and I want you to hold the question not in your mind but in the layer beneath it. What is the one thing in your life right now that you know, at the deepest layer, beneath the surface reasoning, beneath the explanation you give yourself and others, you know it no longer fits? Not because it is objectively wrong, but because you have already moved past it at the ground state level, because the field has already shifted beyond it, because the surface particle is still in the old configuration, but the field beneath it has already moved on. You know what it is. You have known for a while. The surface self has been finding reasons to delay the acknowledgement, has been collecting evidence that it might still fit, has been maintaining the performance of someone for whom it still makes sense. But the ground state knows, the deeper layer knows, the quantum self you have already become knows. And the question is not whether you will eventually acknowledge it. The question is how much longer you will delay the acknowledgement. How many more days or weeks or months of performing the old configuration before you let the surface catch up to where the depth already is? Because here is the thing about delay. It does not protect you from the change. The field has already shifted. The transformation is already complete at the deepest level. Delay does not prevent the surface from eventually rearranging. It only extends the gap. It only prolongs the friction. It only makes the period of mismatch, the period of wearing a life that was tailored for a self you have already outgrown, longer than it needs to be. The hermit crab that has already grown does not protect itself by staying in the old shell. It only delays the inevitable and makes the journey to the new shell more uncomfortable by waiting. The growth has already happened. The shell is already too small. The only question is how long you stay in it. You have already grown. The shell is already too small. You can feel it in the friction. You can feel it in the restlessness. You can feel it in the way certain things that used to feel comfortable now feel like wearing shoes that are slightly too small. The question is not when you will be ready to find a new shell. The question is when you will stop pretending the old one still fits. And here is what the deepest layer of this understanding reveals about that question. You are already ready. You have been ready. The readiness is not something you need to develop. It is the ground state of who you have already become. The quantum self that has already made the transformation is already ready for the life that corresponds to it. You are not waiting to become ready. You are performing not readiness. You are consulting the old self, which is genuinely not ready. because it is a configuration that has already been superseded at the field level, and using its not readiness as evidence that you are not ready. But you are not the old self, you are the ground state beneath it, and the ground state is already ready, has already arrived, has already become the version of you that is qualified to live the life that is pressing up from beneath the surface of your current one. Stop consulting the layer that has already been shed, and start listening to the one that has already arrived. This is the shift. This is the only shift that matters. Not a transformation of the self. The transformation is already complete. A recognition of the transformation. A willingness to let the surface catch up to what the depth already knows. Now let's talk about what other people will say, because this is one of the places where the surface self finds its most convincing evidence for staying in the old configuration. The reaction of the people around you who knew the old version. When you stop performing the old self, when you let the surface begin to catch up to the ground state, the people in your life will notice, and some of them will not like it. Some of them will say things like, "You've changed." And there will be something in the way they say it that sounds like an accusation, like you owe them the old version, like your transformation is a betrayal of the relationship they formed with the surface self you have already outgrown. And the surface self, the coherence maintenance function, will hear that accusation and immediately begin building its case. Will collect evidence that you are being selfish, that you are abandoning people who care about you, that the new configuration is somehow less trustworthy than the old one because it is less familiar. But peel back that surface interpretation and look at what's underneath. The people who are disturbed by your transformation are not reacting to you. They are reacting to the disruption of a pattern they had come to rely on. They had a relationship with the surface self you have been performing. And the surface self was predictable. It was consistent. It was the same from one encounter to the next, in the way that a performed character is always the same. Because it is performing from a script, rather than responding from a ground state. The new configuration, the one that corresponds to your actual ground state, is less predictable, less consistent in the surface sense. More responsive, more alive, more genuinely present in a way that requires the people around you to also be genuinely present. And genuine presence is more demanding than surface performance. It asks more of everyone involved. Some people will rise to meet it. They will find, to their own surprise, that they prefer the less predictable, more genuinely present version of you. That the relationship they have with the ground state version of you is richer and more real than the one they had with the surface performance. And some people will not. Some people form their relationship specifically with the surface performance, with the predictable, consistent script-following version of you. And the ground state version of you, the one that is no longer following the old script, will not give them what they came for. And here is the hidden layer beneath the guilt you feel about that. You cannot honor your own ground state and simultaneously perform the old self for other people's comfort. Not because you are being selfish, because it is structurally impossible. The ground state is not compatible with the performance. You cannot be genuinely present and simultaneously perform a character. You cannot live from the depth and simultaneously maintain the surface for people who are only comfortable with the surface. You have to choose. not between caring about people and caring about yourself, between being genuinely yourself and performing a version of yourself that no longer exists at the level of your actual identity. And when you choose the genuine self, when you let the surface catch up to the ground state, you do not lose the people who matter. You lose the relationships that were only compatible with the performance. And you open space for relationships that can hold the ground state version of you, that can meet you at the depth rather than only at the surface. This is not loss. This is the surface rearranging to match the depth. This is the outer layer finally aligning with the inner one. And the people who leave, the ones who are only comfortable with the performance, they are not leaving you. They are leaving a character that no longer exists, a surface configuration that has already been superseded. They cannot stay in relationship with the old self because the old self is no longer available. The field has already moved. What remains after the surface rearranges is not emptiness. It is the ground state of your actual life. The relationships, the circumstances, the daily texture of existence that corresponds to who you actually are at the deepest layer. The life that fits the way the ancient ruins fit the ground they were built on, precisely, intentionally, aligned with something deeper than the surface city that was constructed on top of them. That life is not ahead of you. It is beneath you. It is what remains when the surface catches up to the depth. And it is already here, already pressing up through the surface of the life you have been maintaining, already making itself known in the friction and the restlessness and the mismatch between who you are and where you are. You are not waiting for it to arrive. You are in the process of letting it surface. Let's go to the final layer, the deepest one. The one that is not a concept or an explanation or even an insight, but a recognition, a direct perception of what has always been true, hidden in plain sight beneath every layer we have explored today. You have always been whole, not as a destination, not as a future state to be achieved through enough transformation and enough healing and enough becoming. As the ground state of what you are, as the deepest layer of your actual identity, as the quantum field of your essential self, which has never been damaged, never been diminished, never been less than complete. The layers that covered it, the conditioning, the performance, the constructed identity, the coherence maintenance function of the surface self. Those layers were not wrong. They were adaptive responses to the environment you were developing in. They were the surface city that was built on top of the ancient ruins. Functional, useful, the right thing for the time and circumstances that produced them. But they were never the foundation. They were always built on top of something older, more precisely designed, more fundamentally real. And as the environment changes, as the circumstances that made those surface layers adaptive shift, the ground state beneath them begins to press up, begins to make itself known, begins to insist on being expressed. This is what you have been experiencing. not a failure of the surface self, not evidence of brokenness. The ground state pressing up through the surface layers, the ancient ruins making themselves known beneath the surface city. The quantum field of your essential self insisting, with increasing clarity and force, on being expressed in the life you are living. And the transformation that has been happening, the one you have been feeling in the friction and the restlessness and the mismatch, that transformation is the surface beginning to rearrange itself to match the ground state, the outer layer finally catching up to the inner one. The surface city finally beginning to align with the ancient foundation beneath it. You did not cause this. You did not earn it. You did not achieve it through enough work, or enough healing, or enough becoming. It happened because it is the nature of the ground state to press up through the surface layers, because the quantum field of your essential self is more fundamental, more stable, more real than any surface configuration built on top of it. Because the ancient ruins are more solid than the city above them, you have already become your new quantum self, not as a future possibility, as a present reality, as the ground state of what you already are, pressing up through the surface layers and rearranging everything above it to match. The surface is catching up. And now, right now, in this moment, something in you recognizes this, not as an idea, as a direct perception, as the felt sense of the ground state making itself known through the layer of your own awareness. That recognition is not the beginning of something. It is the acknowledgement of something that has already been true. The moment the surface catches up to what the depth has always known, you are not who you used to be. You are not on your way to becoming who you are going to be. You are who you already are. At the deepest layer, right now, in this moment. The new quantum self is not coming. It is here. It has been here. Beneath every layer of performance and conditioning and constructed identity. Beneath every moment of doubt and every instance of the old pattern reasserting itself. Beneath every experience of friction and restlessness and mismatch. It has always been here. You have always been whole. You have always been the ground state that the surface was built on top of. And now the surface is rearranging itself to match. Now the outer layer is finally catching up to the inner one. This was always true. You just hadn't looked deep enough yet. And now you have. So here is what I want to ask the community that has gathered in this space. The community of people who refuse to stop at the surface, who know, at some level they cannot always articulate that what they see is not all there is, who sense the hidden layers beneath the visible ones and are willing to go looking for them. What is the one thing you have been performing that you know, at the deepest layer, you have already outgrown? What is the one surface configuration that the ground state of who you have already become is pressing up against? What is the friction in your life right now that is not evidence of incompletion, but evidence of transformation? Share it here. Not because sharing it will make it more real. It is already real, at the deepest layer, regardless of whether you name it. But because naming it is the surface catching up to the depth. Because speaking the truth of the ground state out loud is one of the most powerful ways to accelerate the rearrangement of the surface. And if you are not ready to name it, share this instead. Share the one word that describes the feeling of the ground state, pressing up through the surface layers. The one word that captures what it feels like to be the hermit crab that has already grown, to be the ancient ruins beneath the surface city, to be the quantum field that has already shifted, waiting for the particles to catch up. One word in the comments. Let's see what the community of depth seekers finds at the deepest layer. And if this transmission has done what transmissions are meant to do, if it has lifted a veil you did not know was there, revealed a layer you had not yet seen, given language to something you have been feeling without being able to name it, then let it reach someone else who is standing in the gap between the old surface and the new ground state. Someone who is interpreting their friction as evidence of failure rather than evidence of transformation. Someone who is waiting for a transformation that has already happened at the deepest layer. Share this with them. When you do, you give them access to a layer they have been sensing but could not reach alone, and that act of sharing creates something between two people, a shared depth, a mutual recognition that the surface is not the whole story. The veil thins for both of you. Let's talk about integration, because the deepest understanding is only as useful as what it changes in the daily texture of your life, in the small choices you make when no one is watching, in the way you inhabit the gap between the field level change and the surface rearrangement. Here is the integration principle for everything we have explored today. Stop rehearsing, start inhabiting. Every time you catch yourself rehearsing the old self, performing its preferences, consulting its judgment, maintaining its relationships, speaking its language, stop, not with force, with recognition, with the gentle but precise awareness that you are performing a character that has already been superseded at the ground state level. And then ask the layer beneath it. Ask the ground state. Ask the quantum self you have already become. What would this version choose? Not the version that is trying to be acceptable or consistent or recognizable to the people who knew the old configuration. The version that is already whole, already arrived, already the fullest expression of what you are at the deepest layer. And then make that choice. Not perfectly, not without the surface self's resistance, not without the discomfort of the gap between the old configuration and the new one, but with the recognition that the choice is available, that the ground state version of you is already here and already qualified to make it. This is not a practice you do until you arrive. It is the practice of recognizing that you have already arrived and living from that recognition. One choice at a time, one moment of ground state awareness at a time, one small surface particle collapsing into the new configuration at a time. The field has already shifted. Your choices are how the surface catches up. And over time, not dramatically, not with a single moment of breakthrough, but with the consistency of water finding its level, the surface will rearrange. The outer life will align with the inner ground state. The city above will begin to be rebuilt in alignment with the ancient foundation beneath it. Not because you forced it, because you stopped holding the old configuration in place. Stop rehearsing, start inhabiting, one choice at a time, one moment of recognition at a time, one surface particle at a time. The quantum self you have already become is waiting, not ahead of you, not in the future, not on the other side of more work and more healing and more becoming, waiting at the deepest layer of what you already are, waiting for the surface to catch up, waiting for you to stop consulting the ghost of the old configuration and start making choices from the ground state of the new one. It is here. You are here. The transformation is complete at the level that matters most. The surface will follow. What has been revealed today cannot be re-hidden. The layer beneath the surface has been seen. The ground state has been contacted. The ancient ruins beneath the surface city have been found. The quantum field that has already shifted has been recognized. You cannot unsee a hidden layer once it has been revealed. You cannot go back to looking only at the surface once you have felt the depth pressing up through it. You are no longer a surface dweller. You see the depth now. You feel the ground state. You recognize the transformation that has already occurred at the deepest layer of what you are. And that recognition, that direct perception of the quantum self you have already become, is itself the final surface particle collapsing into the new configuration. The moment the outer layer catches up to the inner one, the moment the surface finally acknowledges what the depth has always known. If this transmission is still moving through you, return to it in a quiet moment, early morning before the surface noise begins, or in the stillness before sleep when the deeper layers are most accessible. The hidden architecture reveals itself differently each time you descend into it. You have already become your new quantum self. Welcome to what was always beneath everything. There is a layer beneath this that goes even deeper. The hidden frequency that your energy field was carrying long before you had language for it, and what happens when you reclaim it. The video on the hidden frequency they erased from your energy field maps precisely what we have been excavating today, but from the inside of the field itself. What you will find there will make everything we uncovered today land at a level beneath where it currently lives.